Hello there, welcome to Fully Painted. Today I'm gonna show you how I painted my Hunters of Huanchi for my Seraphon army. I used this unit as an opportunity to experiment with my army color scheme, and I want to take you through my thought process. So with that said, grab your brushes, we're going to the lab. When painting for an army, I like to change one little thing from unit to unit. But this time around I wanted to change a lot of things. This need for experimentation started out with my stegodons. I painted them to a high standard, but I could feel there were a lot of corners I could have cut. I already had a color scheme picked with my Underworld's Warband, so I only had to find a new recipe. I wanted to try out a new way to paint scales, mostly with transparent paint, a faster way to do my metallics, and a more colorful way to paint my bases. You can see the result here and I really like it, so let's get to the painting. So I start painting these chameleons just like I do all my Seraphon units, with a blue base coat followed by a light grey zenithal for the white skin. Now then, I do a first initial change, which is how I paint my skin on top, the red skin that is. I do it with the straight up contrast paints. Before I did it with opaque paints, and this is a first change. I tried it on my stegodon, but it was with the airbrush, which I cannot do here. But regardless, it works really well because there's a lot of details on those mini. Next change is not pushing one color to the max, which I usually tend to do before switching to another color on the miniature. So this time around I wanted to do my base coat of almost all the colors on the miniature before I started testing highlights, and I use my typical purple for this. Another change is the way I did my black. Usually I tend to go for a first grey layer before applying Black Templar over it, and this time around I thought to myself I could cut that step and go straight to the Black Templar, which I really like as a color. It's got some bluish greenish tones which I really like. I do the spine as well, which is a defining features of my Seraphon. I needed to pick a color for my shields, and I went for the jade after doing some tests. I started with a darker layer of contrast, bluish, over my jade, followed by an overbrush of an off-white, which I saw is a technique I saw on Trend Denizen's stream, which I really liked. You go for a first dark layer, then overbrush of a lighter color, and then a layer of the actual color you want as a contrast, and I really like the result of this. I darken the underside with a darker glaze, and then I go around the mini and keep painting different colors. The frogs they use for poisoning, the base, all the things I can see. And now we get to the fun part of the painting, which is highlights, which usually is my favorite part of painting anything at all. So I start with the red skin here, which I like to highlight with some flesh tones. I don't like using orange or white because it either makes the red orange or pink. And so I got for an in-between, which is a flesh tone. And so I paint this with multiple layers, adding more and more flesh tone, and using my zenithal or volumetric painting logic, which is trying to put my highlights where the sun will hit the most and the surface that are most perpendicular to the light rays. Going for smaller and smaller surfaces, and trying to keep my final highlights for the head, the hands, everything that's very up on the miniature. I'm going for a high contrast on this red skin because usually skin tend to be very shiny, and I'm assuming for a lizard it is. So I want a very contrasty effect. Then I paint the scales, and this is where I start experimenting as well, with the first layer of purple ink to darken the recesses. Then I use my same technique I used for the shield, which is doing an overbrush of white, off-white that is, followed by another thinner layer of my purple ink, which gives me a very saturated result, which I quite like, but find a bit too saturated. So I thought to myself, how about I change it a bit with some more desaturated highlights? And so I went back to my first initial purple and hit mostly edges and raised surfaces, as you can see, like the shoulder here, with a more desaturated color. And so I get this very high contrast between saturated shadows and midtones and very desaturated highlights, which I really, really like. And I feel it gives me somewhat gem effects when you look at gemstones and whatnot. When they get buffed or scuffed on the edges, it's very whitish, and this is the result I wanted. And I pushed this quite high to reinforce this effect I want. The way I paint the grey, it's very similar to the way I painted it on my Stegodons. Nothing new here except the initial Mechanicus standard grey layer that I skipped this time. So first highlight of Mechanicus, followed by adding more off-white for the second highlights. I did try to choose one side of the spine to highlight more than the other to add some dynamism to the painting. Finally, we highlight the shield. I just added some off-white to the contrast color I used to make it a bit more opaque, and then just applied my highlight as necessary, doing a lot of edge highlight with it, but still following the light of the sun. And once again, just like the scales, I get that very gemstone-y look, which I really like, and very contrasty. And I'm just in love with this jade color, and I think I'm gonna use it on my Saurus Wire, is what I'm thinking as I paint this. And now for the less important bits. So I'm not gonna do a lot of experimentation on those, I'm just gonna do them simple and quick. For the leather here, I do a lot of stippling and slashes and dashes to add some texture, and then bring it all together with a coat of contrast paint. It looks somewhat real. Same again for the skulls and the bones. I use a simple recipe, which is my go-to recipe for bones. The most important part here is the way you highlight it. So you follow the light and the volumes of the bones. Very simple here. It's a mix between a sphere and a cylinder, and it's facing the light of the sun. I do a bit of stippling as well to add some texture, but most of it here is done by the volume placement and the highlights. I go up to a very pale off-white to make my bones look somewhat pale. For the balls, some of them have, I reuse that pre-shade followed by glazing techniques I used on the shields. I really like it to add some life and whatnot, so I'm gonna reuse it later on in the army, I think, because it's fun. For the tip of the spears, I reuse the same recipe I do for almost all my spears here. So black, shiny black in the middle, and then jades on the edges. Lots of glazing and edge highlights to do these, so they look somewhat alien or advanced or whatnot. Very simple stuff. And now on to the bases. Didn't want to invent too many new stuff for building, but kept that for the painting. So it's just runes, texture paste, coconut fiber, and some tea leaves. I did try some new things for the vines by gluing the string directly, but it's still not that good. I need to find a new, better way to do this. For the painting, I did my first initial layer of brown, and then it's a lot of mix between transparent paints and opaque highlight layers. So a first contrast paint, a layer of contrast for my stone, where I shade the sides as well, as you can see right now. And then I do a lot of my highlights with opaque paints, and I really like the combo of both. It gives me some colorful shadows and some controlled highlights. Small glaze to bring all the stone together. And then a lot of dry brushing on the ground. I try to use different colors to do this. So this is the brown first, but then I add a sort of reddish brown as well and some green too. That was the mantra of this basing paint, to keep it very colorful. Again, contrast as in transparent paint followed by opaque highlights for the leaves. And I kept doing that. A massive green wash on the tree, which made it look more realistic. Then opaque layers of highlights. It has a very Craft World Studio vibe, this form of highlighting, and I really like it. Some new way of doing moss here that I copied from Andy Waddle, diluted green. I think it looks really good. And finally, a massive wash, as in color wash. There's some green, some brown, some red brown as well, to bring it all together. And just, yeah, a few leaves here and there that I washed too. And the bases are done. And finally we do the metals. Here I wanted to experiment as well. So I did a first layer of contrast paint all over the metallic bits. It kind of serves as a wash layer, and I pushed the shadows in some places with darker glazes of contrast. And now for the experiment is I use my metal paints but as highlights. So the parts that are in shadow are just hit with that first initial contrast layer. So it saves me a first base coating step, basically. And I think it looks really good. And it's a lot shorter. The only trouble this technique has is mostly in the very plain surfaces, because it's the transitions are quite stark. As you can see on the trumpet here. So I should a bit by doing some edge highlighting to make them less dark, I guess. But I'm gonna do some glazing later on as well. Here's the result. Looks really good. I like the metallics do a lot of heavy lifting with this technique. I wanted to try out some dry brushing on this massive shield to give a more aged metal look. And I think it looks pretty nice, but this is not sufficient on its own. So I had to go back with more heavy coats on the areas that are catching most light, so the middle of the shield and whatnot. All the edges as well. But all in all, I really like this result. And this technique, it saved me quite a bit of time, so I wrote it down for the next units I do for this army. And then, as mentioned, some glazing to make the transitions more smooth and boost the shadows as well. And finally, the gems. Very simple recipe here. First layer of white, followed by some contrast paint, and then some edge highlights. Very simple, didn't need anything complicated here. And that's the unit done. I had a lot of fun painting it, and I really liked the final result. I can't recommend enough that you guys try experimenting with your army scheme. You might find some golden nuggets that change the way you paint. Here for me it was how I painted the scales and the bases. They were very fun ways to paint, and while there is probably some more experimentation to be done, I'm gonna stick to them. The real treasure, however, was the way I painted the gold. It was fast and still looked really good, and that's gonna be incredibly valuable when I do my 20 Saurus Warriors. Anyways, that's it for this video. I hope you found it useful. If you did, please give it a like, and if you want to see more tutorials like this one, please consider subscribing. But that's it for me, and I'll be seeing you in the next video. So until then, I hope you stay adventurous and that you keep painting, because painting is cool.